A 60-year-old billionaire who owned half of Manhattan walked into a cafe between his own skyscrapers when a young black waitress approached with trembling hands, quietly slipping him a folded note beneath his coffee cup. What happened next would expose a deadly corporate conspiracy, bring down the most powerful men in real estate, and force the loneliest man in New York to choose between his empire and his soul. Before we start, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like the video, and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more compelling stories. And trust me, you won't want to miss what unfolds next. Now let's continue. The cold November wind rattled the floor-to-ceiling windows of Hal Ward's penthouse office, 73 stories above Manhattan, a view that encompassed nearly everything he owned, yet reflected nothing he truly possessed. At 60, Hal had achieved the American dream on a scale most couldn't fathom. A real estate empire spanning 3 boroughs, towers bearing his name that pierced the skyline, and a net worth that made politicians return his calls within minutes. Yet as he sat behind his obsidian desk in a charcoal Brioni suit, reviewing quarterly reports with his untouched dark roast coffee, the silence of the room pressed against him like the weight of concrete. Ward Holdings, Tower 47 occupancy analysis, he muttered, his gray eyes scanning numbers that should have brought satisfaction but only amplified its emptiness. Revenue projections up 22%. Construction ahead of schedule on the Hudson development. Another billion added to a fortune that had long ago stopped meaning anything. But one report caught his attention, a stack of complaints about Ward Tower construction practices, safety violations ignored, inspection reports mysteriously altered, anonymous employee concerns about structural compromises at the Midtown site. Hal's jaw tightened as he read through the disturbing patterns, each one a crack in the glass monument he'd spent 40 years building. His mind drifted to the early days, when building wasn't about dominating skylines but creating spaces where families could thrive, where communities could flourish. His father, a union carpenter who died on a construction site when Hal was 19, had taught him that every beam mattered, every weld counted, because real people would live and work inside those walls. "Buildings outlive us, son," his father had said, hard hat in hand, dirt under his fingernails. "Make sure they stand for something more than money." Somewhere between the first million and the first a billion, Hal had forgotten that lesson. Corporate lawyers and profit margins had replaced craftsmanship and accountability. When was the last time he'd walked through one of his construction sites without an entourage? When had he last spoken to an actual worker about their concerns? His phone buzzed, another message from his executive assistant about the emergency board meeting scheduled for 10 a.m. Another morning of polished conference tables and partners whose loyalty extended exactly as far as their stock options. Hal stared at his reflection in the darkened window, seeing a stranger in expensive fabric. Where was the passionate young man who'd sworn to build honestly, to never compromise safety for profit? The complaints demanded answers, but the board meeting couldn't wait. Hal glanced at his Patek Philippe, 8:47 a.m. He had 73 minutes before facing his partners, 73 minutes in a world that felt increasingly like a cage built from his own ambitions. On impulse, he stood, grabbed his coat, and walked out, past his assistant's protests, past the security detail, down the private elevator, and out into the November cold. 2 blocks from his headquarters, nestled between Ward Tower East and Ward Tower West, stood a small brick cafe he technically owned, but had never entered, a holdover property from an acquisition years ago, too insignificant to demolish, too quaint to notice. The bell above the door chimed as Hal stepped inside, and for the first time in years, no one recognized him. Meanwhile, across the same city, Elaine Levin was fighting a battle that would intersect with his in ways neither could predict. Hal didn't go to the board meeting. For the first time in 17 years, he simply didn't show up. Instead, he sat in his penthouse office with the blinds drawn, the note from the cafe spread flat on his desk like evidence at a crime scene. The handwriting was hurried but deliberate, the ink slightly smudged as if written in a moment of desperation. "You're being watched. Don't go to the board meeting today." His phone had been ringing nonstop since 10:15. Martin Clay, his COO, Victor Harlan from finance, even his legal team. Hal ignored them all. Instead, he replayed the morning frame by frame. The trembling hands, the folded paper beneath the saucer, the way Elaine's eyes had flickered toward the door as if expecting someone to burst through it. She knew something. And whatever it was dangerous enough to risk warning by a stranger. By noon, Hal had made three decisions. First, he would find out who was watching him. Second, he would discover why someone wanted him away from that meeting. Third, he would confront the waitress who knew his life was in danger before he did. He started with his phone. A private cybersecurity consultant he'd used for hostile takeovers arrived within the hour. A wiry man named Dorian with silver-rimmed glasses and a laptop covered in encryption stickers. Hal watched as Dorian's fingers flew across the keyboard, running diagnostics that revealed what Hal had feared but never wanted to confirm. "Your phone's been cloned," Dorian said flatly, not looking up from the screen. "Someone's been mirroring your calls, texts, and emails for at least 3 months. Professional job, probably spyware installed during a routine software update. Whoever did this had physical access to your device or convinced you to click something you shouldn't have." Hal's stomach tightened. My office. Check my office. What they found made his blood run cold. A listening device smaller than a shirt button, tucked inside the air vent above his desk. Another embedded in the frame of the abstract painting his assistant had gifted him last Christmas. His private landline? Compromised. His computer terminal? Keylogged. "Whoever's doing this wants to know everything," Dorian said, photographing each device with forensic precision. "Your conversations, your passwords, your calendar. This is corporate espionage at the highest level. The question is, who stands to gain from your downfall?" Hal stared at the tiny devices laid out on his desk like dissected insects. Victor, Martin, Marianne Brooks from legal. Any one of them could have planted these or hired someone who could. The people he'd trusted with billions, the partners who smiled at galas and clinked champagne glasses, were orchestrating his destruction from inside his own walls. The betrayal cut deeper than the fear. By evening, Hal returned to the cafe. The dinner rush had thinned, leaving only a handful of patrons scattered across mismatched tables. Elaine stood behind the counter, wiping down the espresso machine with methodical precision. When the bell above the door chimed, her head snapped up, and the color drained from her face. "You," she whispered, the cloth falling from her hands. "We need to talk," Hal said quietly, moving toward a corner booth away from other customers. "I have nothing to say to you." Her voice was steady, but her eyes darted toward the kitchen exit. "Then just listen." Hal sat down, gesturing to the seat across from him. "This morning you slipped me a note telling me not to go to a meeting. At 10:47 a.m., there was an explosion in the underground parking garage at Ward Holdings headquarters. My driver died. 2 of my associates died. If I'd been there, if I'd gone to that meeting like I planned, I'd be dead too." Elaine's composure cracked. Her hand gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. "You knew something was going to happen," Hal continued, his voice low and urgent. "I need to know how. I need to know why you warned me. And I need to know who's trying to kill me." For a long moment, Elaine said nothing. Then she pulled out the chair and sat, her movements weighted with exhaustion and resignation. "My name isn't really Elaine Foster," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's Elaine Levin. 4 years ago, I interned at Ward Holdings under my married name, Elaine Torres. I worked in the compliance department for 6 months before I left." Hal's mind raced, trying to place her face among the hundreds of interns who'd cycled through his company. "My father was Daniel Levin," she continued, and the name hit Hal like a punch to the chest. "He was a site safety supervisor on the Tower 47 construction project. He found structural violations, falsified inspection reports, substandard materials, forged permits. When he tried to report it, he was told to keep quiet. When he refused, he fell from the 42nd floor during a routine inspection." The official story came back to Hal in fragments. Tragic accident, safety harness failure. The family had been compensated quietly, the incident buried beneath legal settlements and non-disclosure agreements. "They called it an accident," Elaine said, her voice hardening. "But my father was the most careful man I ever knew. He triple-checked every harness, every clip, every line. Someone pushed him, or someone made sure his equipment would fail. "Why didn't you go to the police?" Hal asked, though he already knew the answer. "I did," she said bitterly. "They investigated for 3 weeks and concluded it was an equipment malfunction. Case closed. Your company paid us enough money to make sure we'd stay silent. My mother took it. She had no choice. But I couldn't let it go." "So you came back," Hal said slowly, understanding dawning. "You've been investigating from the inside." Elaine nodded. "For 2 years, I've been watching, listening, gathering evidence. I got a job here because it's across from your headquarters, close enough to see who comes and goes, who meets with whom. I intercepted emails, photographed documents people left on tables, eavesdropped on conversations. And 3 days ago, I found something." She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a folded printout. Hal unfolded it carefully, an email chain between Victor Harlan and someone identified only as MC. The words leapt out at him. "Ward will be in the garage for the 10 a.m. arrival. Confirmed device placement and remote detonation protocol." "MC," Hal breathed. "Martin Clay." "Your COO," Elaine confirmed. "The man you've trusted for 20 years is orchestrating your murder. And he's not working alone." Hal stared at the evidence in his hands. Proof that his empire wasn't just corrupt, but lethal. Buildings constructed with compromised materials. Inspectors silenced permanently. Associates willing to commit murder to protect their profits. "My father died trying to expose this," Elaine said, her voice breaking. "I won't let his death mean nothing. But I can't do this alone anymore. They know someone's digging. They're closing in." Hal looked at the young woman across from him, the daughter of a man whose death he'd allowed to be buried, whose warnings he'd never heard, whose courage now stood as the only barrier between truth and complete destruction. "You're not alone," Hal said, the weight of decades pressing down on him. Not anymore. For the first time since he'd built his empire, Hal Ward saw the cracks, not just in glass and steel, but in the foundation of everything he'd believed about loyalty, power, and the price of silence. And he knew that rebuilding would require tearing it all down first. The rain hammered against the windows of Elaine's fifth-floor Harlem apartment like accusations she couldn't escape. She sat cross-legged on the worn hardwood floor, surrounded by the scattered remnants of her father's life. Manila folders yellowed with age, inspection reports marked with his precise handwriting, and 3 encrypted flash drives she'd spent 2 years trying to decode. This was her inheritance. Not money or property, but questions without answers and a truth too dangerous to speak aloud. The apartment was small, a studio with exposed brick walls, a kitchenette barely large enough for 2 people, and a futon that doubled as her bed and workspace. But every surface told the story of Daniel Levin's final months. Construction blueprints tacked to the walls with red circles marking structural violations, printed emails with sections highlighted in yellow, and photographs of Ward Tower 47 taken from every conceivable angle. Her father had been meticulous, a trait inherited from his own father who'd survived 3 decades as a union ironworker. Safety wasn't just Daniel Levin's job, it was his religion. Every site inspection form filed in triplicate, every harness checked twice, every beam measured to the millimeter. The kind of man who'd work 16-hour shifts to ensure concrete was properly cured before the next pour, who'd shut down entire operations if equipment wasn't up to standard. The kind of man who didn't just fall. Elaine reached for the leather-bound notebook her father had kept in his truck, the one the police had returned to her mother in a sealed evidence bag. She'd read it hundreds of times, but tonight the words felt different, heavier with the weight of what she now knew about Hal Ward's own surveillance. November 3rd, found discrepancies in rebar specifications for floors 38 to 44. Ordered grade 60, delivery manifest show grade 40. Confronted site manager Peterson. He told me to stick to my lane. Reported to Brooks and Legal. November 9th, Brooks called me into her office. Said the rebar issue was a documentation error and that raising it further would damage company relationships. Told her I couldn't sign off on the inspection. She reminded me I have a family to support. November 14th, Peterson replaced with new manager. Rebar still hasn't been addressed. Found fire suppression system using non-rated materials. This building will be a death trap if there's ever a fire. November 18th, attempted to escalate to Victor Harlan. His assistant said he was unavailable. I know what unavailable means. I've been here before. The entry stopped on November 21st, 2 days before he died. Elaine closed the notebook, her throat tight. She'd been 17 when it happened, a senior in high school planning for college, oblivious to the danger closing in on her father. She remembered his tension those final weeks, the way he'd stopped sleeping, how he'd spend hours at the kitchen table reviewing documents and making calls in hushed tones. Her mother had begged him to let it go. Danny, we need this job. Please, just sign the papers. But Daniel Levin couldn't sign papers that certified a building he knew would kill people. So they killed him instead. Elaine powered up her laptop, the blue glow illuminating the tears she refused to let fall. Over the past 2 years, she'd pieced together what her father couldn't finish, a trail of financial fraud so sophisticated it had taken her months just to understand the mechanics. Shell companies registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands, all funneling money from Ward Holdings' construction budgets into offshore accounts. The scheme was brilliant in its simplicity. Victor Harlan, as CFO, would approve inflated contracts with suppliers, companies that existed only on paper. The money would be wired offshore, then quietly redistributed to accounts controlled by Victor, Marianne Brooks, and Martin Clay. Meanwhile, actual construction materials would be purchased at a fraction of the cost. Substandard rebar, non-rated fire systems, falsified inspection certifications. The buildings would pass inspection because the inspectors were paid to look the other way. The profit margin would soar, enriching the conspirators while creating structures that were fundamentally unsafe. And if anyone noticed, if someone like Daniel Levin raised questions, they'd be silenced. Her latest discovery made her blood run cold. 3 days ago, while monitoring encrypted communication channels she'd hacked into using credentials stolen during her internship, Elaine had intercepted an email exchange between Victor Harlan and Marianne Brooks. The subject line read, "Final Phase Implementation." The attached document outlined a plan to frame Hal Ward for the entire embezzlement scheme, forged signatures on wire transfers, fabricated emails showing Ward authorizing offshore payments, falsified board minutes documenting his supposed directives. The parking garage explosion wasn't just murder, it was the first move in a corporate coup designed to eliminate Ward and install Victor Harlan as the new CEO of Ward Holdings. With Ward dead and the fraud pinned on him posthumously, Victor and his partners would be untouchable. Elaine had saved everything to one of her father's encrypted flash drives, the same drive she'd been trying to decode for years. 2 nights ago, using decryption software she'd purchased on the dark web, she'd finally broken through the password protection. What she found destroyed her. Her father had known. In the final hours before his death, Daniel Levin had compiled a complete dossier on the fraud. Bank records, supplier contracts, photographs of substandard materials being installed. Even audio recordings of conversations with Marianne Brooks where she'd threatened him. He'd encrypted it all and sent one final email to an address Elaine now recognized as belonging to a federal prosecutor. The email had never been delivered. Someone had intercepted it, rerouted it, buried it, and then they'd buried him. Thunder cracked outside and Elaine flinched. The fear had been building for weeks, the sensation of being watched, of shadows moving in her peripheral vision. 2 weeks ago, a black SUV had idled outside the cafe for 3 hours, its occupants never entering, never leaving, just watching. 5 days ago, her apartment had been broken into while she was at work. Nothing stolen, but everything subtly disturbed, a clear message that her privacy was an illusion. They knew who she was. They knew what she'd found. And they were closing in. The note to Hal Ward had been her last desperate act. If they were going to kill the billionaire and frame him for their crimes, she couldn't let them succeed. Not when she had proof of their guilt. Not when saving him might be the only way to expose the truth about her father's murder. But in warning Hal, she'd revealed herself. Elaine's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "We know what you took. Return it, or end up like your father." Her hands trembled as she read the message, then read it again. The apartment suddenly felt too small. the walls closing in like the coffin her father had been buried in. She grabbed the flash drives, her father's notebook, and her laptop, stuffing everything into her backpack with shaking hands. Rain soaked her the moment she stepped outside, but Elaine didn't care. She had to get somewhere public, somewhere with witnesses. The cafe was closed, but there was a 24-hour diner on 125th Street where she could disappear into the late-night crowd. As she hurried down the rain-slicked sidewalk, Elaine thought of her father's final words to her, spoken over breakfast the morning he died, casual and unremarkable at the time, devastating in retrospect. "Ellie, if something happens to me, don't let them bury the truth with my body." She promised him she wouldn't. And tonight, soaked to the skin and hunted by murderers, Elaine Levin intended to keep that promise, even if it cost her everything. Hal stood alone in the Ward Holdings boardroom on the 73rd floor, staring at the city lights spread below him like a constellation of lies. It was past midnight, and the building's usual hum of activity had dissolved into silence, the kind that amplified every thought, every doubt, every realization that the empire he'd built was devouring him from within. He'd sent his security team home hours ago, claiming he needed privacy to review sensitive documents. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. He no longer knew who to trust. The mahogany conference table stretched before him, its surface littered with printouts from the internal server logs Dorian had extracted before disappearing. The cybersecurity consultant had taken his payment and vanished, leaving behind a warning that chilled Hal to his core. "Whoever's doing this has resources I can't fight. Get out while you can." But Hal couldn't run, not from this, not from the realization that every decision he'd made, every signature he'd provided, every trust he'd extended had been weaponized against him. The documents told a story of systematic identity theft that had been occurring for at least 5 years. Wire transfers to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, each one bearing his digital signature. Transactions he'd never authorized for companies he'd never heard of. Construction contracts approved under his name for materials that were never delivered. Board resolutions documenting decisions he'd never made. Someone had been living a parallel corporate life as Hal Ward, and the real Hal Ward was only now discovering the ghost. His hands trembled as he traced one particular transaction. $4.7 million transferred to Meridian Construction Solutions LLC on March 15, 2023. The authorization bore his signature, not a forgery, but his actual digital certificate, complete with the unique encryption key only he supposedly possessed. The door to the boardroom clicked open, and Hal's head snapped up. Martin Clay stood in the doorway, still dressed in his tailored navy suit despite the late hour. At 62, Martin had been with Ward Holdings for 23 years, since the company was just 3 buildings and a dream. They'd celebrated birthdays together, mourned losses together, built an empire together. "Hal, what are you doing here?" Martin's voice carried concern, but something else flickered behind his eyes, something Hal had never noticed before. "I could ask you the same question," Hal said quietly, not moving from his position at the window. Martin walked to the conference table, his eyes scanning the documents spread across its surface. For a fraction of a second, his composure cracked, a micro-expression of recognition quickly masked by confusion. "What is all this?" Martin asked, but the question came half a second too late to be genuine. "You tell me," Hal replied, watching his oldest friend with new eyes. "These are wire transfers bearing my authorization. Millions of dollars to companies that don't exist. Offshore accounts I never opened. Contracts I never signed." Martin's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Hal, you've been under enormous stress. The explosion, the investigation, maybe you should take some time off." "I wasn't stressed when I didn't authorize these transfers," Hal said, his voice hardening. "I wasn't stressed when someone cloned my phone, bugged my office, and apparently stole my digital identity 5 years ago." "That's ridiculous," Martin said, but he'd moved closer to the door, a subtle repositioning that didn't escape Hal's notice. "Is it?" Hal picked up one of the documents, holding it up to the light. "This transaction was authorized on March 15, 2023 at 11:47 p.m. I was in London that day, meeting with the Rothschild Group about the Dubai project. You were there, Martin. You know I couldn't have sent this wire transfer." Martin's eyes flickered toward the document, then away. Computer logs can be wrong. Time zones, technical glitches. Dorian confirmed it, Hal interrupted. Someone accessed my credentials remotely while I was overseas. Someone who knew exactly when I'd be unavailable, when I wouldn't notice the transactions. Hal, listen to yourself, Martin said, spreading his hands in a gesture of placation that now seemed calculated. You're suggesting someone inside the company is framing you. That's paranoid. Daniel Levin, Hal said, and watched Martin freeze. The name hung in the air between them like smoke from a gun. Who? Martin asked, but the word came out too carefully. The safety supervisor who fell from Tower 47 4 years ago, Hal said, moving closer to his COO. His friend, his brother, his Judas. The man who found structural violations and tried to report them. The man who died before he could expose the fraud. Martin's face had gone pale. That was an accident. The investigation was closed within 3 weeks, Hal finished. Convenient, wasn't it? One less whistleblower, one less problem. His daughter thinks he was murdered, Martin. And after looking at these documents, I'm starting to think she's right. His daughter? Something dangerous flashed across Martin's face. You've been talking to Daniel Levin's daughter? She saved my life, Hal said quietly. She warned me about the explosion. The explosion that killed my driver in a parking garage I should have been in. Tell me, Martin, did you know about that? Did you know someone planted a device in my car? You're insane, Martin said, but he was backing toward the door now, his pretense of concern dissolving. The email logs show you communicated with Victor Harlan the morning of the explosion, Hal continued, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. Subject line, Ward 10 a.m. arrival confirmation. You knew exactly when I'd be there, Martin. You always know my schedule. I'm your COO, Martin said, his hand on the doorknob now. Of course I know your schedule. You were also CC'd on every fraudulent wire transfer, Hal said, holding up another document. Every offshore payment, every ghost contract. Your digital signature appears right alongside mine on 47 separate transactions totaling $73 million. Martin's mask finally shattered. The concern vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating. You built this company on cutting corners, Hal, Martin said quietly. Every tower, every development. We did what was necessary to stay competitive. You knew the game even if you didn't want to see it. I never authorized murder, Hal said, his voice breaking. You never asked questions, Martin shot back. You signed what we put in front of you, cashed the checks, and enjoyed the view from your penthouse. Don't pretend to be innocent now that the bills come due. The words landed like physical blows. Because Martin was partially right. Hal had been willfully blind, had chosen profits over principles, had built his empire on a foundation he'd never bothered to inspect. It's over, Martin, Hal said. No, Martin replied, opening the door. It's just beginning. Victor and Marianne have already moved the final pieces into place. By tomorrow morning, every fraudulent transaction will be traced directly to you. The parking garage explosion will be linked to insurance fraud, and you'll be arrested for embezzlement and attempted murder for hire. The evidence, Hal started, will disappear, Martin finished, along with anyone who knows the truth, including Daniel Levin's daughter. We know you've been meeting with her, Hal. We know she has documents. That problem will be resolved tonight. Terror flooded through Hal, not for himself, but for Elaine. If you touch her, you'll what? Martin smiled without warmth. You're finished, Hal. You built a house of cards, and we're just the wind that knocked it down. You should have taken the fall quietly. Now people are going to get hurt. Martin walked out, leaving Hal alone in the boardroom with his betrayal and his guilt. For 23 years, Hal had believed loyalty could be bought with generous salaries and profit-sharing agreements. He'd believed that success created bonds stronger than blood. He'd believed that the men he'd enriched would stand beside him when the empire he'd built began to crumble. He'd been catastrophically wrong. Hal pulled out his phone, then remembered it was compromised. He grabbed the landline on the conference table, then remembered Dorian's warning that it was tapped. He was completely isolated, completely vulnerable, a billionaire with no way to call for help. The desk phone rang. its shrill tone cutting through the silence like an alarm. Hal stared at it, paranoia screaming that this was a trap, that answering would give his enemies another weapon to use against him. But what other choice did he have? He picked up the receiver. Hello? Mr. Ward? The voice was female, young, terrified. Elaine. Don't say my name. This is a burner phone, but they might be listening. They know you're digging. They know you talked to Martin. How did you? Hal started. I've been monitoring your building's security feeds for 2 years. Elaine cut him off. I saw Martin go up to the executive floor. I saw the look on his face when he left. Mr. Ward, they know about me. They broke into my apartment. They sent me a threat. They're going to kill me unless I return my father's evidence. Hal's grip on the phone tightened. Where are you? It doesn't matter, Elaine said, her voice shaking. What matters is that we're both running out of time. If we don't expose them in the next 24 hours, we're both dead. And the truth about my father dies with us. The line went silent for a moment, filled only with the sound of rain and distant traffic. Meet me, Hal said decisively, tomorrow, somewhere public. Bring everything your father collected. We end this together. Okay, Elaine whispered. But Mr. Ward, don't trust anyone. Not your lawyers, not your security team, not anyone in your company. They've bought them all. The call disconnected, leaving Hal alone in the darkness with the weight of his empire crushing down on him. For decades, he'd believed power meant having everything. Tonight, he learned that true power meant having someone to trust when you'd lost everything else. And right now, the only person Hal Ward could trust was a waitress whose father he'd failed to save. The abandoned construction site loomed against the night sky like a skeletal hand reaching toward the clouds. Tower 47, the building that had cost Daniel Moevin his life, stood frozen in time. A half-finished monument to corruption stretching 42 stories above the East River. The perimeter fence had been breached years ago, its chain links rusted and sagging, the warning signs faded by weather and neglect. Hal Ward stood at the edge of the property at 2:47 a.m., watching shadows shift within the concrete skeleton. The security lights that should have illuminated the site had been dark for months. Budget cuts, according to the reports, though Hal now suspected more sinister reasons. This was where evidence disappeared, where inconvenient truths were buried beneath steel and silence. Movement flickered on the 20th floor, a brief flash of light, Elaine's signal. Hal slipped through the gap in the fencing, his heart hammering against his ribs. At 60, he was no longer the young developer who would climb scaffolding to inspect every beam, but adrenaline and desperation made him feel 20 years younger. He moved through the construction site's ground floor, navigating between concrete pillars and exposed rebar that jutted from the floor like broken teeth. The temporary construction elevator was still operational. Someone had been maintaining it, probably squatters or urban explorers who'd claimed the abandoned building. Hal wrote it up, the ancient machinery groaning with each floor, stopping at 20 where Elaine had said to meet. She stood near the edge of the unfinished floor, silhouetted against the city lights beyond, her backpack clutched to her chest like armor. When Hal stepped off the elevator, she spun around, a flashlight beam catching his face. You came, she breathed, relief flooding her voice. I said I would, Hal replied quietly. Show me what you found. Elaine spread a tarp on the concrete floor, then began pulling documents from her backpack. Her father's blueprints, marked with red circles indicating structural violations, printouts of bank records showing offshore wire transfers, and photographs of substandard materials being installed where code-compliant ones should have been. The evidence sprawled before them like an autopsy of institutional corruption. This is Tower 47's original specification, Elaine said, her flashlight illuminating a blueprint. Grade 60 rebar, fire-rated suppression systems, seismic-compliant structural joints, everything submitted to the city bore your signature. She placed another document beside it, a delivery manifest. This is what was actually delivered. Grade 40 rebar from an offshore supplier that doesn't exist in any business registry. Fire suppression materials that fail every safety standard. Seismic joints manufactured in a factory that was condemned 5 years before this order. The difference in usage? 18.3 million. Money that went to offshore accounts controlled by Victor Harlan, Marianne Brooks, and Martin Clay. Hal's hands shook as he examined the documents. His signature was everywhere, on contracts, on payment authorizations, on inspection certifications. But he remembered none of it. They've been using your identity for years, Elaine continued, pulling out more evidence. Look at this. 47 separate projects, all with the same pattern. Inflated contracts, ghost suppliers, substandard materials. Combined, they've stolen over $200 million from Ward Holdings' construction budgets. $200 million, Hal whispered, the number incomprehensible. And every building they touched is a disaster waiting to happen, Elaine said, her voice hardening. Tower 47 will collapse in a major earthquake. The Hudson development has electrical systems that could spark a fire that would trap hundreds. The Brooklyn residential complex has foundation issues that could cause catastrophic structural failure. Your empire isn't just corrupt, Mr. Ward. It's lethal. The words cut deeper than any betrayal Martin had delivered. Hal had built these towers believing they'd outlast him, that they'd stand as monuments to achievement. Instead, they were tombstones in waiting. My father tried to tell them, Elaine said quietly, pulling out the leather notebook Hal had seen before. He documented everything. Every violation, every threat, every bribe attempt. On November 21st, he encrypted all his evidence and tried to send it to a federal prosecutor. She opened the notebook to the final entry, her flashlight illuminating her father's last words. If anything happens to me, the truth is in the drive. Password, Ellie's birthday. Don't let them bury this. The next day he was dead, Elaine finished, her voice breaking. A sound echoed from below, metal scraping against concrete. Both of them froze. Did you tell anyone you were coming here? Hal whispered. No, Elaine said, but her eyes widened with realization. But they've been following me. The black SUV, the break-in, they must have tracked me. Another sound, footsteps, multiple sets. Climbing the stairs. How many exits? Hal asked urgently, gathering the documents. The elevator in the northwest stairwell, Elaine replied, stuffing papers back into her backpack. But if they're coming up the stairs, security lights suddenly blazed to life across the construction site, flooding the skeletal tower with harsh illumination that eliminated every shadow. Hal and Elaine were completely exposed on the 20th floor, visible from every angle. They activated the site's security system, Elaine said, panic creeping into her voice. They own the security company that monitors this building. Footsteps grew louder, coming from both the elevator shaft and the stairwell. They were being boxed in. The southeast corner, Elaine said suddenly, pointing to the far edge of the floor. There's a construction lift that goes down to ground level. My father used it for material transport. They ran, weaving between concrete pillars and exposed ductwork, their footsteps echoing through the empty space. Behind them, voices shouted commands, professional and coordinated. There, on 20. Cut off the southeast access. Hal reached the construction lift first, a rusted platform designed to transport materials, not people, with a manual winch system and frayed cables that looked like they hadn't been inspected in years. It was a death trap, but staying was certain death. Get on, Hal ordered, stepping onto the platform. Elaine hesitated, looking at the cables. Mr. Ward, this isn't safe. Neither is staying, Hal said, reaching for her hand. She grabbed it, and in that moment of contact, Hal saw her completely. Not as a waitress who'd slipped him a warning note, not as the daughter of a man he'd failed to protect, but as a survivor who'd spent years fighting alone for a truth no one wanted to hear. She'd risked everything investigating his company, gathering evidence, living in fear, all to honor a father whose death had been written off as acceptable loss. Hold on, Hal said, releasing the brake on the winch. The platform dropped, cables screaming through the pulley system as they descended in a controlled fall that was anything but controlled. Wind whipped past them, 20 stories of exposure flying by in seconds. Above them, flashlight beams cut through the darkness. A gunshot cracked, the bullet sparking off metal somewhere above their heads. They're shooting at us, Elaine screamed over the wind. Keep your head down, Hal shouted back, wrapping his arms around her as the platform continued its descent. The ground rushed up to meet them. Hal pulled the brake at the last second, the platform slamming to a halt 3 feet above the dirt, sending both of them sprawling. They rolled off, Elaine clutching her backpack, Hal grabbing her arm, and they ran. Behind them, voices echoed from the tower, security teams mobilizing, vehicles starting up. But Hal and Elaine had a head start, and they disappeared into the maze of sleeping construction equipment and material storage before the lights could find them. They burst through the damaged fence and onto the street, sprinting for 3 blocks before ducking into an all-night diner where fluorescent lights and breakfast crowds offered the illusion of safety. Sitting in a corner booth, both of them breathless and shaking, Hal looked at Elaine, really looked at her, and saw courage that made his decades of corporate ruthlessness seem cowardly by comparison. She'd spent 2 years living in the shadow of her father's killers, collecting evidence one document at a time, knowing that discovery meant death. She'd warned him despite the risk, fought beside him despite the fear, and carried her father's truth through bullets and betrayal. "We can't go back to our homes," Elaine said quietly, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug a sympathetic waitress had brought. "They know where we live. They know everything." "Then we don't go back," Hal said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. "We go forward. We take everything you've collected, everything I've discovered, and we burn their empire to the ground." Elaine met his eyes, and for the first time since he'd met her, she smiled, not with happiness, but with the grim satisfaction of someone who'd finally found an ally in an impossible war. "My father would have liked you," she said softly. "I wish I'd known him," Hal replied, meaning it more than he'd meant anything in years. "I wish I'd listened before it was too late." Outside the diner window, Manhattan glittered with the lights of buildings Hal had built, monuments to ambition that concealed foundations of fraud. But beside him sat living proof that truth could survive even when buried beneath concrete and conspiracy. And together, they would make sure it finally saw daylight. Hal Ward walked into Ward Holdings headquarters at 8:47 a.m. wearing his most expensive suit and his most practiced smile. To anyone watching, he was simply the billionaire CEO arriving for another routine board meeting. Composed, confident, untouchable. No one could see the rage and fear churning beneath his carefully maintained facade, or the flash drive containing Daniel Levin's evidence hidden in his jacket pocket. The security guard nodded respectfully as Hal passed through the lobby. His assistant greeted him with coffee and the morning's agenda. Everything appeared normal, a carefully choreographed performance of corporate civility. But Hal knew what was coming. He'd spent the hours since leaving the diner preparing for this moment, the moment his partners would attempt to destroy him publicly. The boardroom on the 73rd floor was already occupied when Hal arrived. Victor Harlan sat at the far end of the table, his silver hair perfectly styled, his expression a mask of professional concern. Marianne Brooks, the company's legal head, sat to his left, her designer suit as sharp as the trap they'd set. And Martin Clay, Hal's COO, his friend of 23 years, his Judas, sat directly across from where Hal always positioned himself. "Gentlemen, Marianne," Hal greeted them neutrally, taking his seat at the head of the table. "Thank you for coming on short notice," Victor said, his voice carrying the false warmth of a practiced liar. "We have some urgent matters that require immediate attention." Hal set down his coffee, meeting Victor's eyes with steady composure. "I'm listening." Victor opened a leather portfolio, extracting a thick stack of documents. "Over the past 72 hours, our internal audit team uncovered some deeply disturbing financial irregularities. Unauthorized wire transfers, offshore accounts, shell companies receiving millions in construction payments." "That's concerning," Hal said evenly, though his pulse hammered against his temples. "What's the scope?" "Approximately $200 million over 5 years," Marianne interjected, sliding a document across the table. "All transactions authorized using your digital signature and executive credentials." Hal picked up the document, scanning the wire transfer authorizations that bore his name. Each one was technically perfect, correct dates, accurate account numbers, his signature rendered flawlessly. To anyone examining the records, these transactions would appear completely legitimate. "I didn't authorize these," Hal said quietly. "That's what we hoped you'd say." Martin spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a rehearsed note of reluctance. Because if you had authorized them, Hal, we'd be looking at deliberate embezzlement rather than identity theft. The word hung in the air. Embezzlement. However, Victor continued, pulling out more documents, we also found these emails sent from your account to our offshore suppliers. In them, you explicitly direct the use of substandard construction materials to increase profit margins. You also authorize payments to foreign entities in exchange for falsified inspection certifications. Hal took the printed emails, reading words he'd never written and messages he'd never sent. The writing style mimicked his terseness. The terminology matched his usual vocabulary. Whoever had forged these had studied him intimately. Approved. Use grade 40 rebar for floors 38 to 52. Bank the difference offshore. HW. Inspection issues at Hudson site can be resolved with appropriate compensation to city officials. Handled discreetly. HW. Daniel Levin becoming a problem. Legal to address per our standard protocol. 8WW. That last email made Hal's blood run cold. They'd fabricated evidence linking him directly to Daniel Levin's death. This is forgery, Hal said, his voice hardening. Someone's been using my credentials to... We considered that possibility, Marianne interrupted, her tone professionally sympathetic. So we brought in a forensic cybersecurity firm. Their analysis confirms these emails originated from your computer terminal using your login credentials during hours when building security logs show you were in the office. She slid across another report, a thick forensic analysis complete with timestamps, IP addresses, and security badge swipes. Every piece of evidence had been meticulously fabricated to place Hal at his desk during each fraudulent transaction. The security logs have been altered, Hal said, but even he could hear how weak the defense sounded. That's a serious accusation, Victor said, leaning forward. Are you suggesting that multiple independent systems, email servers, security databases, financial transaction records, have all been compromised to frame you? Hal looked around the table at the faces of his board members, seeing the trap close with elegant precision. To claim innocence required believing in a conspiracy so sophisticated it strained credibility. To accept responsibility meant admitting to crimes carrying decades of prison time. Where were you on March 15, 2023 at 11:47 p.m.? Marianne asked, consulting her notes. London, Hal replied immediately. Meeting with the Rothschild Group. The meeting concluded at 9:30 p.m. London time, Martin said, and his voice carried genuine regret or a masterful simulation of it. You returned to your hotel at 10:15 p.m. The wire transfer in question was executed at 11:47 p.m. Eastern Time, 4:47 a.m. London time. You had access to your laptop. You had the credentials, and you had the motive. What motive? Hal demanded. Victor exchanged glances with Marianne and Martin before answering. 3 weeks ago, you consulted with divorce attorneys about separating your personal assets from company holdings. 2 months ago, you met with a private wealth manager about liquidating portions of your Ward Holdings stock. 6 months ago, you told Martin you were considering early retirement. All true, Hal had been exploring those options. Conversations he'd thought were confidential, now weaponized as evidence of criminal intent. You were planning your exit, Marianne concluded, siphoning money offshore before disappearing from the company you built. The parking garage explosion was supposed to be your cover. Fake your death, collect the insurance, and live anonymously on embezzled funds. The audacity of the lie took Hal's breath away. They'd twisted every legitimate action into evidence of guilt, constructed a narrative so seamless it would convince any prosecutor. That's insane, Hal said, but his voice lacked conviction. Is it? Martin asked softly. Hal, I've known you for 23 years. I've watched you become increasingly isolated, increasingly paranoid about the company's direction. I've seen you question every decision, second-guess every partnership. Maybe the pressure finally broke you. The betrayal in Martin's words cut deeper than any fabricated evidence. This was the man who'd stood beside Hal through every crisis, celebrated every success, shared every burden. And now he sat across the boardroom table, delivering the killing blow with manufactured compassion. The board has voted, Victor announced, pulling out a final document. Effective immediately, you are suspended from all executive duties pending a full investigation. Your access to company systems is revoked. Your security clearances are terminated. We're recommending the board appoint interim leadership. You, Hal finished, you'll be appointed interim CEO. Victor had the grace not to smile. Only until this matter is resolved. If you're innocent, Hal, the investigation will prove it. But they all knew there would be no exoneration. The evidence was too complete, the conspiracy too sophisticated. Hal would be destroyed publicly, prosecuted criminally, and Ward Holdings would pass into Victor's control with the board's blessing. Hal stood slowly, leaving the damning documents on the table. You've thought of everything. We're trying to protect the company, Marianne said. This isn't personal. Yes, Hal said quietly, meeting Martin's eyes. It is. He walked out of the boardroom, out of his company, out of his empire, carrying nothing but the knowledge that he'd been betrayed by men he'd enriched and trusted. The security guards who'd once nodded respectfully now watched him with suspicion. His assistant avoided eye contact as he passed her desk. Word had already spread. Hal Ward was finished. Outside, Manhattan's November wind cut through his expensive suit like contempt. Hal stood on the sidewalk, staring up at the towers bearing his name. Monuments to ambition now revealed as monuments to fraud. Everything he'd built had been poisoned from its foundation, and he'd been too blind to see it until the corruption had metastasized beyond treatment. His phone, a burner he'd purchased that morning, buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I found it, the encrypted drive my father left. But the decryption is complex. It'll take 12 and 16 hours to break. Stay hidden. They'll come for you now. 12 to 16 hours. Hal had to survive that long while Victor and Martin orchestrated his complete destruction. He had to stay free while the evidence that could save him remained locked behind encryption his enemies had spent 4 years trying to break. Hal Ward had entered the boardroom as a billionaire. He left as a fugitive. But he wasn't broken. Not yet. Because somewhere in Harlem, a waitress who'd lost her father to these same men was fighting to unlock the truth that would bring them all down. And Hal would make sure she had those 12 hours, even if protecting her cost him everything he had left to lose. 72 hours after Elaine's last message, Hal's burner phone remained silent. He'd spent those 3 days in a budget motel in Queens, hiding under a false name, surviving on takeout and paranoia. Every time footsteps passed his door, every time a car engine idled too long in the parking lot, Hal's pulse spiked with the certainty that Victor's people had found him. He tried calling Elaine's burner number 17 times. Each call went straight to a generic voicemail that told him nothing. She'd vanished. At 11:34 p.m. on the third night, Hal's phone buzzed with an incoming email from an account he didn't recognize. North Star Holdings at Proton Mail. Com. The subject line was a single word, watch. Hal's hands trembled as he opened the email. There was no text, only a link to a private video feed. He clicked it, and his world collapsed. The video showed a dim warehouse, industrial, abandoned, with water-stained concrete walls and rusted metal beams crossing overhead. In the center of the frame sat Elaine Levin, bound to a metal chair with zip ties cutting into her wrists. Her green blouse from the Café, the same one she'd worn the morning she saved his life, was torn at the shoulder, stained with dirt and what might have been blood. Her face bore fresh bruises, one eye swollen nearly shut. Her lips split and bleeding, but her eyes burned with defiance that made Hal's chest ache. Mr. Ward, Victor Harlan's voice came from off-camera, smooth and professional, as if he were conducting a board meeting. I assume you're watching. Good. We need to have a conversation about your future, or rather, the lack thereof. Victor stepped into frame, dressed in his usual tailored suit, looking absurdly civilized against the backdrop of industrial violence. He walked to Elaine, placing one hand on her shoulder with casual cruelty. This is Daniel Levin's daughter, Victor continued. I'm sure you remember Daniel, the safety supervisor who became inconvenient 4 years ago. He had this annoying habit of documenting things he shouldn't have seen, raising concerns about structural integrity when we needed projects completed on schedule. His death was regrettable but necessary. Elaine flinched but said nothing, her jaw set in stubborn silence. His daughter inherited his unfortunate tendency toward curiosity. Victor said, gripping Elaine's shoulder harder. For 2 years, she's been collecting evidence, hacking our communications, building a case against us. She even warned you about the parking garage. A miscalculation on our part, but one we're now correcting. Victor moved to a table just visible at the edge of frame, retrieving a stack of documents. These are asset transfer agreements, Hal. Very simple, very legal. They transfer complete ownership and control of Ward Holdings to a newly formed entity, North Star Capital. All they require is your signature, properly witnessed and notarized. The camera angle shifted as someone, probably Martin, adjusted it to show the documents more clearly. Hal could see the legal language, the corporate seals, his name typed in precise legal formatting, awaiting his signature. You built an empire on convenient compromises, Victor said, his voice hardening. You signed inspection reports without reading them. You approved budgets without questioning discrepancies. You created the system that allowed us to prosper, Hal. And when Daniel Levin tried to expose that system, you let us silence him. You didn't pull the trigger, but your willful ignorance loaded the gun. Elaine's eyes glistened with tears she refused to let fall. Now his daughter will die cleaning up your mess, Victor concluded. Unless you do the one thing you've always done best, sign the papers and walk away. You have 12 hours to deliver signed and transfer documents to the address I'll send you. If you comply, Ms. Levin lives. If you refuse or if you contact the authorities, she dies. And unlike her father's death, this one won't look like an accident. Victor leaned close to Elaine, speaking loud enough for the camera to capture. Tell him, Ms. Levin. Tell him what you found on your father's encrypted drive. Go to hell, Elaine spat, blood flecking her lips. Victor backhanded her across the face, the sound echoing through the warehouse like a gunshot. Hal flinched at the screen, rage and helplessness warring in his chest. The drive contains proof that could destroy us, Victor said calmly, examining his hand as if checking for damage. Bank records, emails, audio recordings. 4 years of evidence compiled by a man who actually believed integrity mattered more than profit. His daughter has spent the last 72 hours breaking the encryption. She's close, maybe hours away from accessing files that would send us all to prison. Victor turned back to the camera. So here's the deal, Hal. You sign over Ward Holdings, disappear with whatever offshore money you can salvage, and Mrs. Levin gets to live with the knowledge that her father died for nothing. Or you refuse, she dies, we destroy the evidence, and you spend the rest of your life in prison for crimes we'll ensure stick to you like blood on concrete. The video feed went dark. Hal sat in the motel room's cheap chair, staring at the blank screen, his mind racing through calculations that went beyond profit margins and risk assessment for the first time in decades. This wasn't a business decision. This was a moral reckoning he'd avoided his entire career. He could sign the documents, transfer everything he'd built, every tower, every property, every asset, to Victor and his conspirators. Walk away a broken billionaire with offshore accounts worth perhaps $50 million, enough to disappear into comfortable obscurity. Elaine would live. The evidence would be destroyed. The corruption would continue. And Daniel Levin's death would remain an accident. Or he could refuse. Refuse and watch Victor execute a woman who'd risked everything to expose the truth. A woman whose father had died trying to protect people who would never know his name. A woman who'd saved Hal's life when she could have let the parking garage explosion solve her problems permanently. For 60 years, Hal Ward had chosen the path of least resistance, building, compromising, profiting. Every moral crossroad had been decided by spreadsheets and shareholder value. He'd convinced himself that success justified the methods, that wealth insulated him from consequences. But staring at the dark screen where Elaine's battered face had been moments before, Hal understood with brutal clarity that he'd been lying to himself for decades. He wasn't going to sign. Instead, Hal opened his laptop, a used machine purchased with cash from a pawn shop, and began examining the video file's metadata. Victor had been arrogant, streaming the feed live rather than sending a pre-recorded clip. That arrogance left digital breadcrumbs, IP addresses, routing information, geolocation data embedded in the video stream. Hal had built his empire on understanding systems, on finding weaknesses in structures others assumed were solid. Now he turned those skills toward the only thing that mattered, finding the warehouse before Victor's 12-hour deadline expired. The IP address traced to a commercial internet provider serving the Brooklyn waterfront. Cross-referencing that with Ward Holdings' property database, which he still had cached copies of, Hal identified 3 abandoned warehouses in that area. One had been slated for demolition, one was undergoing environmental remediation. The third was a defunct shipping facility that Ward Holdings had acquired in a bankruptcy auction 7 years ago and never developed. That one. Hal checked the time, 12:17 a.m., 11 hours and 43 minutes until Victor's deadline. But Hal wasn't waiting for deadlines anymore. He grabbed his coat, pocketed the burner phone, and walked out of the motel room into the November cold. The man who'd entered that room 3 days ago had been a billionaire CEO paralyzed by self-preservation and guilt. The man who left was something different, someone willing to lose everything for something that couldn't be measured in quarterly reports or stock valuations. He was a man with something worth fighting for. And for the first time in 60 years, Hal Ward knew exactly who he was. Not the cold CEO who'd built towers while ignoring the bodies buried in their foundations, but someone who'd finally found the courage to tear those towers down if that's what truth required. The Brooklyn waterfront waited in the darkness, and somewhere in that industrial wasteland, Elaine Levin was counting the minutes until either rescue or execution. Hal Ward had 12 hours to rewrite the ending Daniel Levin never got to see, and he wasn't planning to waste a single minute. The warehouse was exactly where Hal had predicted, a decrepit shipping facility on the Brooklyn waterfront. Windows shattered, walls marked with graffiti and decay. But Hal hadn't gone there. Instead, he'd sent Victor a message at 3:47 a.m., 9 hours before the deadline. "I'll sign, but not at some warehouse. Tower 47, where Daniel Levin died, midnight. Just you, Martin, and me. No security, no witnesses. Then this ends." Victor's response came within minutes. "Agreed. Come alone, or she dies." Now, at 11:53 p.m., Hal stood on the 42nd floor of the half-finished skyscraper that had started this nightmare 4 years ago. The same skeletal structure where Daniel Levin had fallen or been pushed to his death. Wind howled through the exposed framework, carrying the scent of rust and rain from the East River below. But Hal wasn't alone. Hidden in the construction elevator shaft 20 feet away, Elaine Levin worked frantically with a laptop balanced on her knees, her battered face illuminated by the screen's blue glow. Blood still crusted her split lip, but her fingers flew across the keyboard with desperate precision. "How much longer?" Hal whispered into the wireless earbud connecting them. 2 minutes, Elaine replied, her voice tight with concentration. "The construction site surveillance system uses Hikvision cameras with default passwords, exactly the kind of security vulnerability my father documented. I'm almost in." Hal had found Elaine 6 hours earlier, still zip-tied to the chair in the warehouse. Victor's men having left only a single guard who'd succumbed to a wrench applied strategically to his skull. She'd been beaten but unbroken, and when Hal had freed her, she'd refused medical attention. "No hospitals," she'd said through swollen lips. "Not until we finish this. Not until they pay for what they did to my father." Together, they'd planned the trap. The construction elevator groaned to life, announcing Victor's arrival. Hal stepped into the center of the exposed floor, backlit by the city lights stretching beyond the skeleton of steel and concrete. Victor emerged first, dressed in a charcoal overcoat, holding a briefcase that presumably contained the transfer documents. Martin Clay followed, his expression unreadable in the shadows. "You came," Victor said, surprise flickering across his features. "I keep my promises," Hal replied quietly. "Unlike some people," Martin added, moving to flank Victor. Victor set the briefcase on a makeshift table, a sheet of plywood balanced on cinder blocks, and opened it. The asset transfer documents were precisely organized, tabs marking where Hal's signature was required. "Everything's ready," Victor said. "Sign these, and you walk away. Ward Holdings becomes North Star Capital. You disappear with whatever money you've hidden, and this unpleasantness ends." "Where's Elaine, Ashish?" Hal asked. "Dead if you don't sign," Victor replied flatly, "or released once the transfers are complete and filed with the SEC, your choice." Hal picked up the pen Victor offered, staring at documents that would erase 60 years of work. Behind Victor and Martin, Elaine's voice whispered in his earbud. I'm in. Accessing the surveillance feed now, 60 seconds. Before I sign, Hal said slowly, I need to understand something. Daniel Levin, did you kill him yourselves or did you hire someone? Victor smiled without warmth. Does it matter? He was a problem. Problems get solved. That's business. It was Martin, actually, Victor continued conversationally. He has a talent for making accidents look authentic. Loosen Levin's safety harness just enough that a strong gust of wind or a slight push would send him over the edge. 42 stories, the same floor we're standing on now. Martin's face remained emotionless, confirming the confession. And the parking garage explosion? Hal asked, buying time. Remote detonation, Martin said, speaking for the first time. Simple C4 attached to your car's fuel tank. You were supposed to die, Hal. The fact that a waitress saved you was inconvenient. 30 seconds, Elaine whispered in Hal's ear, streaming to every major news outlet in New York. CNN, ABC, NBC, The Times. Live feed starting in 3, 2. A tiny red light flickered to life on the surveillance camera mounted to a nearby steel beam, barely visible, but Hal saw it. The construction site's security system, dormant for months, was now broadcasting everything. Here's the truth, Victor, Hal said, setting down the pen without signing. I'm not giving you anything. Not my company, not my silence, not my surrender. Victor's expression hardened. Then Elaine Levin dies. Elaine Levin is currently hacking into this construction site's surveillance system and streaming our conversation live to every news organization in New York. Hal interrupted. Everything you just confessed, Daniel Levin's murder, the parking garage bombing, the embezzlement, it's all being broadcast in real time. Victor's head snapped toward the surveillance camera, its red recording light now glowing steadily. His face went pale with understanding. You're lying, Martin said, but his hand moved inside his coat. Check your phones, Hal suggested. Victor pulled out his phone, his fingers shaking as he navigated to CNN's website. The headline already scrolled across the breaking news banner. Live. Billionaire CEO confronts alleged murderers in unfinished tower. No, Victor breathed, watching himself on the screen, confessing to murder. Martin drew a gun, a sleek 9mm that caught the city lights as he raised it toward Hal. You self-righteous bastard. You built this system. You created us. I know, Hal said quietly, not moving. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life paying for that. But tonight, it ends. The gunshot cracked across the 42nd floor. But Martin wasn't aiming at Hal. He'd spotted Elaine emerging from the elevator shaft, laptop still clutched to her chest. The bullet sparked off the steel beam inches from her head. Hal lunged at Martin, 60 years old but fueled by adrenaline and rage. They collided, the gun spinning away across the concrete floor. Martin was younger, stronger, but Hal fought with the desperation of someone who had everything left to lose. Victor ran, sprinting toward the construction elevator, abandoning his partner and his plan. But Elaine stood between him and escape, her laptop open, still streaming. You killed my father on this floor, Elaine said, her voice steady despite her battered face. You pushed him 42 stories because he believed buildings should be safe, because he thought truth mattered more than profit. Your father was a fool, Victor spat, reaching for the gun Martin had dropped. He fired wildly, the bullet ricocheting off steel, striking a fuel tank left by construction crews years ago. The explosion was immediate and devastating. A fireball that engulfed the eastern section of the floor, turning night into day. Hal felt the platform beneath him shudder, heard the groan of compromised steel. The substandard materials Victor's scheme had installed 4 years ago, the grade 40 rebar instead of grade 60, the non-rated joints, the falsified certifications, were failing under stress they were never designed to withstand. The floor began to collapse. Martin scrambled toward the elevator as concrete chunks fell into darkness below. Victor followed, leaving Hal and Elaine on the disintegrating platform. The steel beam supporting Hal's section gave way with a metallic shriek, and he fell, 42 stories of empty air yawning beneath him. His hand caught the edge of a broken rebar jutting from concrete. The metal cut into his palm, but his grip held. He dangled above the abyss where Daniel Levin had fallen, wind tearing at his clothes, fire roaring above him. "Mr. Ward," Elaine's voice cut through the chaos. She appeared at the edge of the broken platform, lying flat on her stomach, extending her hand toward him. The same hand her father might have reached for in his final moments. The help that never came, the rescue that failed, the justice that died with him. "Take my hand," Elaine screamed. Hal released one hand from the rebar, reaching up towards salvation offered by the daughter of the man he'd failed to save. Their hands clasped, her grip strong despite her injuries, his fingers locking around her wrist with desperate strength. She pulled, muscles screaming, and Hal's other hand found purchase on the concrete edge. Together they fought gravity and guilt, rewriting the ending Daniel Levin never got. Hal hauled himself onto the stable section of the platform, and they collapsed together, gasping, as sirens wailed from the streets below. Fire trucks, police, federal agents responding to the live-stream confessions that were already viral across every news platform in America. Martin and Victor stood frozen at the elevator, surrounded by flames, their escape route cut off. Martin raised his gun one final time, but federal agents were already ascending the construction stairs, weapons drawn, shouting commands. Victor Harlan raised his hands in surrender. Martin Clay dropped his weapon, defeated by the same surveillance technology they'd used to spy on Hal for years. As dawn broke over Manhattan, Hal Ward and Elaine Levin sat on the 42nd floor of Tower 47, the building that had taken her father's life and nearly taken theirs. Below them, the empire Hal had built was collapsing under the weight of truth, exposed by a waitress who'd refused to let corruption bury justice. "He would have been proud of you," Hal said quietly, looking at Elaine. "He would have liked you too," Elaine replied, "if you'd listened sooner." "I know," Hal said and meant it. The truth had finally seen daylight, and it burned brighter than any tower Hal Ward had ever built. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and second chances. Hal sat beside Elaine's bed, watching November sunlight filter through the blinds, casting stripes across the white sheets. 3 days had passed since Tower 47. 3 days of FBI interviews, media frenzy, and watching his empire dismantle itself piece by carefully documented piece. Elaine's face was a patchwork of healing bruises, her left arm in a cast from the fall, but her eyes remained sharp and uncompromising. "Victor Harlan died this morning," Hal said quietly, setting down the newspaper that had dominated his breakfast. "Heart attack in federal custody. His lawyers are calling it suspicious timing." "Convenient," Elaine replied, her voice still hoarse from smoke inhalation. "Dead men can't testify against their co-conspirators." "Martin Clay was arrested in Dubai yesterday," Hal continued, scanning the article. "Interpol caught him trying to board a flight to a non-extradition country using a forged passport. He'll be back in New York by the weekend." Elaine nodded, a ghost of satisfaction crossing her features. "My father would have wanted to see them in court, to watch them answer for what they did." "They will," Hal assured her. "The evidence your father collected, the encrypted drive we finally decoded, it's airtight. Bank records, audio recordings, construction documents. Between that and the live stream from Tower 47, the prosecution has 18 counts of fraud, conspiracy, and murder." The FBI had cleared Hal 3 days earlier. A forensic analysis of the digital signatures, combined with testimony from Dorian, the cybersecurity consultant, and Elaine's documented investigation, proved that Hal had been systematically framed. The wire transfers, the forged emails, the falsified authorizations, all orchestrated by Victor, Martin, and Marianne Brooks over 5 years. Marianne had flipped within hours of Victor's death, trading testimony for a reduced sentence. Her cooperation revealed the full scope of the conspiracy: $247 million embezzled through ghost companies, 43 construction projects compromised with substandard materials, and at least 7 deaths, including Daniel Levin's, directly attributable to the fraud. "The board voted this morning," Hal said, changing the subject to what really mattered. "Ward Holdings is being restructured, dissolved, actually. The company will be broken into smaller entities, each with independent oversight and ethical compliance boards." "Good," Elaine said firmly. Buildings that could collapse shouldn't bear anyone's name. 37 structures need immediate remediation. Hal continued, the weight of it crushing. Tower 47, the Hudson Development, the Brooklyn Residential Complex. Combined cost, $680 million. I've pledged my entire remaining fortune to the repairs. Every building will be brought to code or demolished and rebuilt. Elaine studied him with eyes that had seen too much for someone in their early 30s. That's everything you have left. It's everything I should have spent in the first place, Hal replied. Your father tried to tell me. I just wasn't listening. A nurse entered to check Elaine's vitals, providing a momentary interruption. When they were alone again, Hal reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a folder. The restructuring board asked me to give you this, he said, handing it to Elaine. She opened it carefully with her uninjured hand, scanning the document inside. Her eyes widened. Director of Ethical Compliance and Safety Oversight for Ward Legacy Foundation, she read aloud. 6-figure salary, full benefits, and veto power over any construction project that doesn't meet enhanced safety standards. It's Daniel Levin's position, Hal explained quietly, the one he should have had power to enforce, the one that might have saved his life if I'd created it 4 years ago. Elaine's hand trembled as she held the offer letter. This is what my father fought for. Real accountability. Real power to stop corruption before it kills people. Only if you accept, Hal said. Only if you trust that this time, the system will be different. Will it? Elaine asked, challenging him with the directness that had saved both their lives. Hal met her gaze without flinching. I'm making it a condition of the restructuring. Every project requires your approval. Every inspection report comes to you first. Every budget is transparent and auditable. And if anyone tries to silence you, if anyone even suggests you compromise safety for profit, the entire foundation dissolves and the assets go to families affected by the fraud. In writing? Elaine pressed. In writing, Hal confirmed. Legally binding. No loopholes. Elaine looked at the document for a long moment, and Hal saw the war playing out behind her eyes. Grief for what her father lost. Hope for what his death might finally mean, and the terrible responsibility of carrying forward a legacy built on sacrifice. I accept, she said finally, but only if the foundation bears my father's name. The Daniel Levin Safety Foundation. Done, Hal agreed immediately. 6 weeks later, on a January morning that carried the sharp clarity of new beginnings, Hal walked into the small cafe between the skeletal remains of Ward Tower East and Ward Tower West. Both buildings were scheduled for demolition, their foundations compromised, their materials substandard, their very existence a monument to corruption that would soon be erased. But the cafe remained. The bell above the door chimed as Hal entered, and he found Elaine behind the counter wearing her green blouse and white apron, the same outfit from the morning she'd saved his life, now meticulously repaired. Her bruises had faded to shadows, her arm cast replaced by a thin brace, but the strength in her eyes had only intensified. Mr. Ward, she greeted him with the hint of a smile. Dark roast? Just Hal, he corrected gently. And yes, please. The cafe had changed since his first visit. Photographs now lined the walls, images of construction workers, safety inspectors, and families. In the center hung a portrait of Daniel Levin in his hard hat, his eyes kind but uncompromising, the same expression his daughter wore when she'd slipped Hal that warning note. I bought the cafe last week, Elaine said, pouring his coffee. Turns out the previous owner was retiring. It seemed appropriate. This is where everything changed. A cafe owner and a foundation director, Hal observed. Your father would be proud. He'd say I was working too hard, Elaine replied, bringing 2 cups to the corner table where Hal had sat that first morning. But he'd also say that meaningful work is never really work. They sat together as morning light flooded through the windows, casting the same golden glow that had illuminated Hal's loneliness and Elaine's courage months earlier. But everything had changed. The billionaire who'd once ruled glass and concrete now worked from a modest office in Queens, overseeing the demolition of his empire and the construction of something humbler, but infinitely more valuable. The first Daniel Levin Safety Foundation project breaks ground next week, Hal said, sipping the coffee that tasted better than anything served in boardrooms. Affordable housing in Brooklyn, every beam inspected, every weld certified, every worker protected by the standards your father died defending. 200 units, Elaine added, having reviewed every specification personally. Built for people, not profit margins. Built for meaning, Hal corrected softly. Outside the window, Ward Tower East groaned as demolition crews began their work, bringing down the monument to Hal's ambition, one floor at a time. But Hal didn't feel loss watching it fall. He felt relief. The towers had been beautiful from a distance, but poisoned at their foundations. Better to tear them down and build something honest than to let them stand as lies wrapped in glass. Do you ever regret it? Elaine asked quietly. Losing everything to expose the truth? Hal considered the question, really considered it. He'd gone from a net worth of $4.7 billion to perhaps $100 million after the remediation costs, legal fees, and victim compensation fund. His name, once synonymous with success, now carried the complicated weight of redemption in progress. Former partners avoided his calls. Society galas no longer sent invitations. The penthouse had been sold to fund repairs. But sitting in a cafe co-owned by a woman whose father he'd failed, drinking coffee that cost $3 instead of $50, watching morning light illuminate honest work instead of corporate machinations, Hal felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Peace. No, Hal said honestly. I regret that it took me 60 years to understand what your father knew at 30. That buildings are only meaningful if the people inside them are safe. That profit is only valuable if it doesn't come at the cost of someone's life. Elaine's eyes glistened, but she smiled through it. He would have liked you, Hal. Once you started listening. I'm still learning, Hal admitted, but I'm finally listening to the right teachers. They sat in comfortable silence as the cafe filled with the morning rush, construction workers grabbing coffee before shifts, families sharing breakfast, students hunched over laptops. Real people living real lives in a space that no longer existed to maximize profit but to serve community. The billionaire who'd once owned half of Manhattan now owned one modest apartment in a purpose that couldn't be measured in quarterly earnings. The waitress who'd slipped a warning note to a stranger now directed a foundation that would reshape how buildings were constructed across the city. And together, in a cafe nestled between crumbling towers and rising hope, they'd found something neither had expected when their lives collided that November morning. Connection, conscience, and the understanding that true power isn't measured in skylines dominated, but in lives protected. Same time tomorrow? Elaine asked as Hal prepared to leave. Same time tomorrow, Hal confirmed. Because some habits, like morning coffee in a cafe where truth began, were worth keeping. And some partnerships, forged in fire and redeemed through sacrifice, would last longer than any tower Hal Ward had ever built. The morning light continued to flood in, washing away shadows and illuminating the simple truth Daniel Levin had died defending. That what we build matters less than who we become in the building. And for the first time in 60 years, Hal Ward understood what it meant to be truly wealthy. If this story moved you, share the moment. Don't let it fade. Follow Motherland Stories and tap that like button to keep these voices alive. Every day we uncover strong stories, raw truths, and quiet acts of courage that shape our world. Join a circle of listeners, dreamers, and changemakers, because every story deserves to be heard. This wasn't just an episode, it was a call to remember. Silence hides injustice. Courage exposes it. At Motherland Stories, we don't turn away. We bear witness. Subscribe and stand with stories that challenge power and celebrate truth.